Snow carried silence with it, draping the Wyoming backcountry in white sheets that muted everything, sound, shape, time. Pines stood motionless, black silhouettes pinned against a colorless sky. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wind moved in low sighs, rustling the outer edges of a dying storm. Jack Rowan drove slow. The old truck groaned beneath him, heater barely breathing, windshield wipers smearing half-frozen moisture across glass. His knuckles were pale against the wheel, one eye on the ridgeline to his left, the other squinting through the thick curtain of falling snow. His thermos rattled in the cup holder, untouched. He wasn't supposed to be out here. Not this deep into the pass. Not this late in the day. But the southern herd had crossed earlier than expected, and something in his chest, a familiar kind of ache, had told him to go. So he'd gone. Now it was near dark, and the roads were less road than memory. As the truck crawled around a bend, something flickered at the edge of his vision. A shape. Jack braked. The tires skidded gently across packed snow and came to a halt. He leaned forward, trying to make sense of things sprawled near the ditch just past a fallen branch. It wasn't large. Not human. Not debris. He stepped out. Cold hit him like a slap, slicing straight through the flannel under his jacket. Snow sank into his boots. He moved slow, cautious, not because he was afraid, but because something about the shape demanded reverence. The way churches demand whispers. It was a foal, barely more than a breath of a thing, curled in on itself, legs bent at awkward angles, belly heaving in tiny, uneven swells. Its coat was matted with ice, ears crusted with frostbite, muzzle gray with dirt and cold. No mother, no herd, no tracks but its own, fading fast. He stood above it for a long moment, unmoving. Memories came uninvited. A crib, a highway, a single flashlight beam cutting through snow. The day he had been too late. He shook them off. Damn it! He knelt and placed a hand against the foal's side. Faint warmth pulsed beneath the skin, barely there. Its eye opened just a sliver, black and glassy, unseeing. Jack looked around. The world answered with wind. You weren't meant to last, he muttered. But he didn't move. Instead, he pulled off his coat and slid it beneath the foal, lifting her gently. She was lighter than she looked. Bones wrapped in thin skin, a shiver of life held together by sheer luck. He cradled her close to his chest and staggered back toward the truck. Inside, heat sputtered through the vents as he placed her on the bench seat beside him and turned the dial to high. He drove faster on the way back, not reckless but urgent. Every few seconds, he glanced down. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Her head lolled against the folded coat, eyes closed now, as if whatever spark still lived inside her had decided to trust him. The cabin was 30 miles off-road, a structure he'd built himself after the funeral. Pine walls, one chimney. A small barn out back he hadn't used for anything but storage in over a year. He carried the foal inside and laid her near the fireplace. The hearth was cold. He threw down kindling with practiced hands, struck a match, and fed flame into life. The room began to glow. Shadows crept back into corners. She didn't move. He found towels, warm water, and one of his old wool blankets. Swaddled her in layers, drying her legs, her back, her neck, his touch uncharacteristically gentle. Her breathing remained thin but constant. Her chest fluttered like a leaf caught in wind. "Come on," he whispered, brushing his fingers across her ear. "Don't stop now." He stayed beside her the whole night. At some point, he fell asleep sitting upright, head bowed, hands still resting against her ribs. She survived till morning. That was more than he expected. The second day brought no real change. She didn't stir, didn't open her eyes. But she stayed alive. Jack adjusted the fire, rotated her gently, and dabbed warm water across her muzzle. He managed to get a few drops down her throat with a syringe he found in the tack kit. He didn't speak much. Not yet. Just worked. By the third night, he started reading aloud. Something about the quiet needed breaking. He picked the book off the table, without looking at the title. It didn't matter. The story didn't matter. It was the sound of his voice, the rhythm of language, the steady murmur that once filled his home before it became an echo chamber. Once upon a time, he began, voice rough with disuse, in a kingdom made of ice. The foal didn't move, but she listened. He knew it. Somehow, on the fifth day, just as dawn spilled soft gold across the cabin floor, her eyes opened. Jack was at the stove, pouring water for instant coffee, when he felt it. Not a sound, an absence of stillness. He turned. She was watching him. Her eyes were darker than the space between stars, wide and impossibly clear. No panic, no confusion, just awareness. The kind of knowing that made him freeze. He took a slow step forward. She didn't flinch. Another step. Then he crouched, holding out his hand. She blinked, tilted her head. Then, without drama or hesitation, she reached out and touched her muzzle to his palm. It wasn't an accident. It was choice. He didn't say anything. Couldn't. His throat had closed around something unnameable. They stayed like that for what felt like hours. The cabin silent except for crackle of flame and 2 steady heartbeats finding rhythm again. He called her Ember because she hadn't burned out, because in the coldest part winter she had sparked. The days that followed took on a pattern. He fed her every few hours, walked her gently through the yard once her legs could hold, wrapped her in the blanket at night. He didn't ask himself why he was doing it anymore. He just did. Neighbors started to talk. A few friends from town asked if he'd lost his mind, raising a wild foal like some newborn house pet. He ignored them. What did they know about loss? About second chances wrapped in hooves and breath? He was careful never to restrain her. No halter, no ropes. When she grew strong enough to step into the yard alone, she did, but she never wandered far. She always came back. Sometimes he'd catch her watching him, not with curiosity, but something deeper, a kind of recognition that unsettled him. One night, weeks after her arrival, a storm rolled in, shaking the walls with wind. He woke with a jolt and raced to the barn. She was there, waiting at the door, unafraid. He opened it. She stepped inside, pressed her head to his chest. Jack closed his eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, he wept, not out of grief, out of gratitude. The storm passed before dawn. By morning, the sky was clean again, and Jack stood on the porch with mug in hand, watching Ember trot the perimeter of the yard. Her tail flicked high, her legs stretched with confidence. She was no longer a dying thing. She was becoming herself. He sipped his coffee, heart steady for the first time in memory. Somewhere inside him, something had shifted. He didn't know where this road would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking it alone anymore. Morning crept in slow, carrying with it the hush that follows a storm. The sky outside was a pale wash of slate blue, clouds lingering like breath held too long. Inside the barn, Ember lay curled in a thick bed of hay and wool, her small frame rising and falling in the same measured rhythm that had become Jack's new clock. He watched her from the open doorway, steaming mug in hand, boots planted in dirt that still held last night's chill. She was stronger now, just enough. Her ribs no longer stuck out like question marks. The tremble in her legs had eased. She'd learned to stand, then walk. Though her gait was still wobbly, her muscles unsure. The world was a new language she was just beginning to speak. Jack leaned on the post and sipped slowly. "You ever wonder why you made it?" he asked aloud, not expecting an answer. Ember lifted her head and blinked at him. She didn't come when he called. Never had. That wasn't the nature of wild things. But she watched him, always, with that same unflinching calm that unnerved and comforted him at once. He hadn't gone into town since the storm. He didn't want the questions, the half-sincere concern, the side glances. Let them think he'd lost his mind out here on the edge of the range with a half-dead foal and too many ghosts. He set the mug down and opened the gate to the pasture. It wasn't much, a sloped stretch of wind-scarred field bounded by split-rail fencing. But the grass was beginning to green again, patches of stubborn life pushing up through frost. Ember stepped into it carefully, each hoof fall deliberate. Jack followed at a distance, letting her set the pace. She sniffed at clover, pawed at a stick, nipped once at a leftover patch of snow before backing away. Her eyes scanned the treeline. She was searching for something. Though whether it was memory or instinct, Jack couldn't tell. He knew better than to pretend he'd replaced her herd. Whatever tether had pulled her into his orbit had only done so for a reason that remained beyond naming. She wasn't his. Not really. But she stayed. He walked beside her for a while, hands shoved in his coat pockets, speaking low about fence lines and weather, about the things that lived in silence because no one ever bothered to give him sound. She listened, not with her ears, but with something else. A kind of stillness he hadn't felt since before the accident, since before the morning when everything he'd built unraveled like rotten thread. That night, as twilight settled in shades of lavender and blue, Jack brought her back to the barn. She stepped inside without prompting and lay down in the far stall. The oil lamp flickered on the table. He sat on the crate beside her and pulled the old book from a shelf. A paperback Western, corners curled, pages stained with time. Chapter 7, he murmured, opening to where he'd last stopped. His voice rasped across the first few lines, but steadied as he read. Ember's ears twitched. He imagined she preferred poetry, but this would do. As he turned the page, the barn door creaked open. He turned fast, muscles tightening. A figure stepped into the threshold, tall, female, wrapped in a heavy sheepskin coat. Lena Coyle. She pushed back her hood, revealing wind-flushed cheeks and long braids tucked into her collar. "You're hard to find," she said softly. Jack stood, careful to keep himself between her and Ember. "Didn't know I was supposed to be found." Lena glanced around the barn, her eyes pausing briefly on the foal, then drifting back to him. There'd been reports. A lone Mustang foal, rescued off the ridge, brought back to a cabin up near Hollow Point. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. "I figured if it was anyone, it'd be you." Jack shrugged, didn't ask for attention. "No," she said, "but you sure stirred it." Ember shifted behind him, lifting her head, ears pricked forward. She didn't bolt, just watched. "She should have died out there," Lena added. "Most of them do." She didn't. Lena stepped inside, her boots crunching straw. "That doesn't change the law." Jack's jaw tightened. "She's not a prisoner." "No," Lena said, glancing toward Ember. "But she is wild, and she can't stay here forever." Jack felt the air thicken, like something unseen had stepped into the room with them. He folded his arms. "She's not ready. Maybe not. But one day she will be. And when that day comes, I'll let her go." The words came out sharper than he intended. Not a promise. A warning. Lena held his gaze a moment, then nodded once. "Then do it right. Let me help when the time comes. She'll have the best shot if she's tracked, reintroduced properly. We're not the enemy, Jack." He didn't answer. She stepped back toward the door. Before leaving, she paused and looked once more at Ember. "She's beautiful," she said, and then she was gone. The barn felt smaller after that. Ember rested her head again. Jack stared at the doorway long after the wind had erased Lena's tracks. He didn't sleep that night. He stood at the fence, watching the dark. Memories came in flickers. Not the crash. He never remembered the crash, but the aftermath. The hallway. The folded hands of the chaplain. The look in the doctor's eyes. All that silence. All that loss. He hadn't saved his daughter. But Ember, she was still here. And somehow, the weight of that difference settled in his chest like a fire no storm could put out. He went back to the barn just before dawn. She was awake, standing, waiting. He reached out. She stepped forward, pressed her nose into his palm. "I know," he whispered. "We both got things to finish." Behind them, the sky began to lighten. Not much, just enough to hint at morning. And in that breath between night and day, Jack felt something crack open inside him. Not pain, not hope, just space. Wind swept down the hills like a memory, warm with spring but edged in something restless. The last of the snow had melted, leaving the pastures damp and dappled with wildflowers pushing up through thawed earth. Jack walked the fence line in the early light, hammer in one hand, a length of wire coiled over his shoulder. Ember trailed behind him, her gait smoother now, legs longer, steadier. She didn't cling. She didn't need to. She just stayed close, like gravity had tethered them together, and neither felt the need to test its limits. He had rebuilt the western gate yesterday, repainted the back wall of the barn, hauled stones from the creek to fix the sagging foundation under the porch. Things he'd put off for years, not because he didn't have time, but because until recently he hadn't cared. But now his hands found purpose and routine again. Ember gave him rhythm, and in her quiet presence, he found himself becoming someone who woke with reason, someone who spoke his thoughts aloud, even if only to a creature who never answered with words. That morning, he found her watching the sky, a hawk circle above the ridge, casting long shadows on the grass. Ember stood still, neck arched, her ears flicking forward as if deciphering some language the wind carried. Jack watched her, the way her muscles held tension just beneath stillness, the way she seemed to absorb the world rather than simply react to it. There was something deeper inside her than instinct, something deliberate. "Do you remember where you came from?" he asked quietly. "Or are you trying to forget it like I did?" She turned, met his gaze for half a second, then walked past him toward the trees. Jack exhaled. He'd been waiting for her to outgrow the need to stay close. Part of him dreaded it. Part of him understood it was always going to happen. By mid-afternoon, clouds gathered to the west. Rain was coming, nothing heavy, just enough to soften the fields. He pulled a tarp over the lumber stack behind the shed and glanced across the yard. Ember stood at the edge of the tall grass, nose lifted, body tense. Then she bolted, not in fear, not wild with panic. She ran, straight across the field, hooves pounding mud, legs cutting arcs through space like they remembered every inch of open land they were born for. Jack dropped the hammer and just watched. The way she moved, it wasn't escape, it was declaration. She made a wide loop along the fence line, past a rusted windmill, then curved back toward the barn at full gallop. Jack stepped back as she neared, but she slowed before reaching him, pulled up close, breathed hard. He could see it in her eyes. She was testing the edge. That night, he didn't sleep right away. Sat on the porch long after the sun sank behind the hills, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. He could feel the shift now. Ember had changed. Something in her was stretching, reaching beyond the borders she'd accepted. She was healthy, capable, still young, but not helpless. Letting her go wasn't the problem. Knowing when that was, he was still sitting there when a pair of headlights crested the rise. The vehicle moved slow, tires crunching gravel until it stopped in front of the barn. A door opened. Lena stepped out. She raised a hand in greeting. "Didn't mean to surprise you." "You didn't." "Rain's coming," she said, glancing at the sky. "Figured I'd get a look at her before the next round of bureaucracy falls into my lap." Jack nodded. "She's different now." "I figured." Lena tucked her hands into her coat pockets and looked toward the paddock. "We just processed the winter migration data. That herd she likely came from, 15 of them never made it through. Found 2 carcasses near the canyon wall. One of them was a mare, recently foaled." Jack looked away. "You think that was her mother?" "We'll never know." They stood in silence for a moment. The only sound was the whisper of breeze through brittle weeds. "She's old enough to reintegrate," Lena said gently. "Strong enough, too. We could tag her, release her near a managed herd. Let her decide if she wants to stay." Jack didn't speak. "She's bonded to you," Lena added. "That might not fade, not entirely. But it's not a reason to keep her penned." "She's not penned," Jack said, his voice calm but edged. "I know. I never close the gate." Lena studied him, then nodded once. They walked together toward the barn. Ember was inside, lying down but alert. When she saw them, she stood and moved toward Jack, brushing her nose against his sleeve before turning her gaze to Lena. The interaction was measured, cautious. Not fear, not resistance, just careful interest. "She reads people," Lena said, stepping back a little. "She's reading me. She always does." Lena exhaled. "It's your call, Jack. No pressure. But when you're ready, when she's ready, I can be here to help." He didn't answer. Later, after she left, Jack sat on the hay bale beside the stall. Ember stood near the door, watching the dark like it held answers she hadn't quite earned yet. "Someone once told me," he said softly, "that you don't keep wild things because you're afraid they'll leave. You keep them because, for a while, they remind you of what it means to stay." Ember turned toward him slowly. "I never thought I'd be able to let go again. I thought if I did, there'd be nothing left. But you changed that." She stepped forward and lowered her head. He pressed his hand to her brow and closed his eyes. "Not yet," he whispered, "but soon." The rain began just before dawn. A soft tapping on the barn roof, steady and soothing. Jack fed Ember early, filled the water trough, and watched her stretch out under the overhang, ears flicking at the sound. The storm didn't scare her. Nothing much did anymore. She wasn't a broken thing pieced back together. She was a fire that had never gone out, only banked low until someone cared enough to tend the flame. Now she burned steady. Jack stared at her and saw it clearly. The moment was coming, the time when keeping her would be selfish. He leaned against the doorframe and ran a hand through his hair, damp with the edge of rain. He could let her go. He just didn't know if he could do it without breaking all over again. But maybe this time the breaking wouldn't be ruin. Maybe it would be the beginning of something new. The question wasn't whether he could release her. It was whether he could trust what she left behind. The gate swung open with a soft creak, metal brushing against it, worn smooth by time and weather. Jack stood beside it, one hand on the post, the other clenched at his side, watching Ember stare at the path beyond. The sky was a pale wash of early gold, clouds still pink on the edges, light spilling like soft breath across the hills. Everything smelled of damp earth and spring. The world was ready. He wasn't sure if he was. Ember didn't step forward immediately. She stood in place, her head lifted, nostrils flared as if reading the wind like a map. Jack knew what she smelled: sage, pine, the distant scent of other animals carried from the north. He knew she felt it in her bones, the quiet humming of something ancient telling her to go. "I won't stop you," he said softly. Her ear twitched, but she didn't look back. He'd meant to say more, to offer goodbye, or at least some kind of blessing. But nothing came. No words could match the moment, and none were needed. Slowly, deliberately, Ember stepped beyond the threshold of the paddock. Her hooves made barely a sound on the softened dirt. She didn't bolt, didn't run. She walked forward with the grace of something that had always known its direction, past the last row of trees, into the wild where no fences stood. Jack stood still long after she disappeared. The cabin felt hollow that afternoon, not broken, just quiet in a way he hadn't experienced since before she came. He moved through the rooms on instinct, making coffee he didn't drink, folding towels he hadn't used. He left the barn open, hay scattered across the floor where her stall had been, her feed bucket still hanging crooked on the post. The days passed. Each morning, he walked to the ridge with a thermos and stood looking out over the valley. Sometimes the wind carried the echo of hoofbeats. Sometimes it didn't, but he waited, not with hope, not with expectation, just with presence. On the fifth evening, a sound came through the dusk like a song returning home. Jack turned slowly. Along the tree-line, a figure moved, quick and low, followed by another and another. Not Ember alone. A herd. Mustangs. They moved in a loose, scattered pattern across the edge of the meadow. Their coats gleamed in the light, chestnut, dun, smoky gray. At the center, leading them with quiet confidence, was a silver-dappled mare. Ember. Jack's breath caught in his throat. She was taller now, more filled out, her body strong and fluid. There were new scars on her side, faint lines along her flank. She had changed. She was not the same creature he had once cradled in his coat. She was more. Ember stopped at the edge of the pasture and raised her head. Their eyes met across the distance. He saw no confusion in hers, no surprise, only recognition, and something like a promise. She stepped forward just a few paces, then paused. Behind her, the others waited. One younger colt followed her closer, but stopped when she did, watching her for cues. Jack took one step toward the fence, heart pounding in his chest. She came the rest of the way. Their reunion didn't need touch. She stood on the opposite side of the fence, head low, gaze steady. Jack leaned forward, pressing his palm against the wood. For a long moment, they simply existed there, two souls shaped by fire and frost. Understanding passed between like warmth and winter. Then, without fanfare, Ember turned and led her herd back into the trees. Jack didn't call after her, didn't move. He smiled. In the following days, signs of the herd came and went. Hoof prints by the creek, bent grass where they'd bedded down, a mane hair caught in the fence. Ember never lingered long, but she passed through often enough that Jack knew she was choosing to return. Not out of need, not out of habit, but out of trust. One morning, as fog clung low over the pasture, he stepped outside and found her there again. Alone, she stood at the edge of the barn, watching him with calm expectation. "You bringing trouble?" he asked with tired grin. She nickered once, soft and low, then lowered her head and waited. He approached slowly. She didn't move. He touched her brow. Her eyes closed. That was the only greeting they needed. He spent the morning brushing her coat, trimming her hooves, refilling the trough. She stood still, breathing slow, her body loose and comfortable. There was no sign of tension, no hesitation, only presence. She left that afternoon, disappearing with the breeze. But she left something behind, an imprint like a memory pressed into dust. Jack returned to the cabin, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the small box he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a folded photograph. His wife, his daughter, a snow-covered trail in the background, that same ridge, that same fence. He set the photo on the sill, beside the window that looked out toward the barn. They were part of it now, part of the story. Weeks passed, seasons shifted. The ranch kept breathing in its quiet way. Jack repaired the roof before the rains came, fixed the windmill, planted wildflowers near the fence. He didn't speak of Ember to anyone who passed through, not because he was hiding her, because she didn't belong to anyone's version of the world but her own. And then came the morning he didn't expect. It was midsummer. The air was thick with heat and insects. Jack walked down to the river bend, following the trail they'd once taken together. And there, in the clearing near the water's edge, stood Ember. Beside her, a foal. Not a mirror of her, but close. Smaller, lighter, wide-eyed and impossibly still. It ducked behind her legs as Jack approached, but Ember stood her ground. Jack crouched and held his breath. The foal stepped forward. Only a single step, then looked at him, and in that moment, he understood the weight of what Ember had given him. Not just her trust, but a legacy. He didn't reach out. He didn't try to touch. He just nodded. "You did good," he whispered. Ember turned, flicked her tail, and nudged the foal back toward the trees. They left together, disappearing into the shade. Jack stood by the water, hands in his pockets, and stared at the place where they'd been. The ache in his chest was no longer sharp. It was full. He knew she would return. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not for months. But she would. She always had. And now she always would.